Welcome back to Decouple for a much anticipated episode interviewing none other than Dr. James Hansen. I've been talking about this happening since the spring, but Dr. Hansen has been busy working on a book and wanted, I think, to save the interview for after. So we're very lucky. We're here in Berlin. Dr. Hansen, I'm going to call you James from now on, has come to a special protest and gathering of pro-nuclear advocates that came here to try and save the last German 6 reactors. We're going to get into that, but first I'll just get the bona fides out of the way, as I tend to do. So James is the American adjunct professor directing the program on climate science awareness and solutions of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. According to Wikipedia, he's best known for his research in climatology, his 1988 congressional testimony on climate change that helped raise broad awareness of global warming, and his advocacy of action to avoid dangerous climate, including being arrested no fewer than 5 times.
Right.
So, Dr. Hansen, James, welcome to Decouple. We're thrilled to have you.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so just in doing that background research, I saw your birth date, so 1941.
Yeah.
And it made me interested because, obviously so much has happened throughout your life, and the awareness of climate change, has become more and more pronounced as the time has passed. But I'm just wondering, when did it sort of come onto your map? When did you start thinking about it? Did you imagine that you'd end up doing what you did when you were a little boy or when you were young? I know you grew up in farming country, you told me. So just in broad strokes, fill us in a little bit on the sort of how your life led you to where you are.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky, to grow up in Iowa, which you could afford to go to college,
right, even
if you didn't have much money, and especially lucky because the physics department at the University of Iowa was headed by James Van Allen, a brilliant physicist who discovered the radiation belts around the Earth. I actually started out in mathematics as a freshman, and then I took a course in physics, and I got attracted to his department. And this was in the era when space was just coming into being. I mean, Van Allen had an instrument on the first satellite. And I had the dream then of being an astronaut.
Okay. Yeah.
A scientist astronaut.
Right.
And so when I was in graduate school, I saw this advertisement for postdocs at NASA, and I applied for that and got a position at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City. I got really excited about the research and about trying to understand other planetary atmospheres.
Yes.
And when I got to NASA, I proposed an experiment to go to Venus on the Pioneer Venus mission, which got selected. And I got so involved in the research that I decided I gave up on the idea of being an astronaut.
Right. So was it investigating the atmosphere of Venus that led you to be concerned about the Venusification of Earth? Is that accurate way to put it?
Well, that's not really accurate in the sense that the planets do give us this family of atmospheres which covers all the way from frozen planets to very hot planets. So it helps you understand the physics in a broad sense. But, I mean, the Earth turns out to be much more interesting than Venus. Venus is essentially a dead planet, and it's covered by this sulfuric acid haze. And it was nice to sort of figure out what the clouds were made of, but much more interesting to try to understand how humans are possibly altering the climate on Earth.
Right. So, just curious, did you run across James Lovelock during your time at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory? Because, some of the things you've been describing, the electron capture device that detected the CFCs, I think he designed.
Lovelock was amazing. Yeah, I had lunch with him in the UK once. Yeah, he was involved in the ozone problem. He was the first one. He developed the ability to measure CFCs very precisely. So yeah, that was Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading him recently, and he has the Gaia hypothesis that life helps create the conditions for life on Earth. And if I'm remembering correctly, he was talking about how Earth is really a planet that's too close to the sun. We should have global average temperatures that are much higher, like 40 degrees, but that life through its drawdown of CO2, and I think it was algae in the oceans that help seed clouds, kind of maintains a habitable planet for us. Is that
Well,
a view you share?
Well, no, he raised a lot of interesting questions. Yeah, climate is complicated, and aerosols and gases both affect the temperature. And the remarkable thing is that Earth has gone through. When I was a postdoc, scientists were wondering, well, why didn't Earth freeze over at any time? The assumption was that if the Earth ever froze over, that it would be stuck in that condition. But what we didn't recognize was that if the Earth does freeze over, then the volcanoes, which will continue to be active and put CO2 into the atmosphere, the CO2 will accumulate more and more until it gets to a level that it begins to melt the ice. And that has happened several times.
So when did you go from curiosity to alarm? Tell us about that phase, I guess.
Well, so our first major paper on CO2 and climate was in 1981, and already at that time we had a pretty good idea of how warm it was during prior interglacial periods, and also how sea level changed, and it was clear already in that paper that we couldn't burn all the CO2 or we would melt most of the ice on the planet, and so you would lose all your coastal cities.
Right.
So already at that time, it was relevant. The information was relevant to policymakers, but it had to become a lot clearer before you would actually expect policy to begin to be affected.
And so you personally, again, that transition from curiosity to alarm, like when did you start getting really concerned enough to do what you did, to break the rules, to speak truth to power? That must have been a change. I'm just wondering what the kind of trigger was for you.
No, the trigger was simply that I want to give an honest description of our research, and I agreed to testify to Congress about it, and did testify a few times in the 1980s, but one of the times I was asked via NASA headquarters to change parts of the testimony. And I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
So these changes were being proposed from the White House. It was 1986 for the first time that my testimony was changed.
And what did they change?
They changed wording to make it seem that it was more uncertain as to whether there were important climate effects of the increasing greenhouse gases.
Gotcha.
And in 1988, which was the year that got all the attention because of climate, the huge climate anomaly then, that was extreme drought. The Mississippi River dried up and it was over 100 degrees in the East Coast. So that and I said that I was 99% certain that the warming had reached a level that it was could be blamed on increasing greenhouse gases. And then it was the next year when I went to testify again that OMB again made changes, and Al Gore did note, I actually sent a fax to him and asked him if he would ask me about specific sentences in my testimony, because I said those were written by OMB, not by me. So he immediately saw the opportunity to make a big issue of this and get more attention for climate change.
You mentioned the word, when they changed your testimony, that they were trying to make things sound more uncertain.
Yeah.
I think there's been a change in the climate debate. There used to be climate denialists or deniers, and I feel like that's almost slipped away, but it's replaced by lukewarmists. And one such lukewarmist would be, I believe it's Stephen Koonin, who wrote a book recently called Unsettled, and just what you said about uncertainty seemed to sort of fit with that. James Lovelock, he talks a lot about how when people become very subspecialized, they can lose the bigger picture. I understand Koonin's not a climate scientist himself, but do you have, just because that book was a recent sort of bestseller, do you have any, I'm not sure if you've read it or read some of the controversy around it, but what's your feeling then more in general about that change from climate deniers towards this kind of lukewarmism that we're seeing now?
Well, it's not surprising that people don't see the threat because of the delayed response of the climate system. So, we can now see that things are beginning to happen, but there's a lot more in the pipeline just because of the inertia of the system due to the heat capacity of the ocean and the time that it takes for ice sheets to begin to melt enough to make a important sea level change. So the problem is that we're building in, because the eventual response to the gases that are already in the air is probably one that we don't want to accept. It's likely to mean loss of coastal cities. So we have time to make changes because of the inertia is our friend in one sense. It gives us time to try to reverse some of the things that we've done to the atmosphere. But it's not going to be easy, given the fact that the gases are coming from energy use, and energy is required for our present-day society.
So I don't know if you can walk us through the things that are most concerning for you. You've mentioned sea level rise. There seems like there's the physical impacts, and then there's the political responses, which are likely to be messy with big refugee flows and things. But maybe flesh out the picture of your concerns or your dominant concerns.
Yeah, well, I think my major concerns were, until the last few years, and still the central things that make it an existential threat are, first of all, the fact that low latitudes are now becoming uncomfortable. Even the subtropics in the summer are just too hot to work outdoors. So by subtropics, I include the Mediterranean and Middle East region and the Southwest United States and parts of Southeast Asia. And that's with just over 1 degree Celsius warming. So if we get twice that, it's going to put immigration pressure from those latitudes. And if, in addition to that, you get sea level rise such that coastal cities are threatened, and we're beginning to lose those, then the immigration pressures are going to make the planet practically ungovernable, it seems to me. And that could be during the lifetime of today's young people.
I was reaching out to you quite a while ago about seeing you at COP. In the end, you didn't go, and we've met in Berlin, and we'll talk about why we're here in Berlin in just a moment. But why didn't you come to COP? What convinced you not to come?
Well, a combination of things, but I've gone to several COPs, so I pretty much know what's going to happen. They're going to work at things around the edges, and there are useful things. It's good to have these COPs because they do some useful things, like an agreement to try to reduce methane emissions, for example, is a good idea. But they don't address the fundamental problems. We're not going to solve the climate problem if we don't have a price on carbon. As long as fossil fuels don't have to pay their cost to society, we will keep using them. Fossil fuels are remarkable. 1 gallon, 3.8 liters of petrol contains the energy equivalent of 400 hours of work by a healthy adult. And that's how the standard of living has increased over the last few centuries because of fossil fuels. So we'll keep using them as long as they don't have to pay for the effects of air pollution, water pollution, and climate change.
Right, right.
So that's the one thing. The other thing is we need carbon-free energy. We need to have electricity, which is carbon-free. If we do that, the problem becomes solvable because we can make liquid fuels from electricity if we have carbon-free electricity.
Right, right. So, I was talking to a mutual acquaintance of ours, and he was saying, I think, I'm not sure exactly when it would have been, maybe in the very early 2000s, you were getting to be in a pretty bad mood about things. And I think he talked to you about nuclear energy, and you got the bug, I think. So tell us about that. I don't know, was that a change of opinions for you? Had you had opinions on nuclear energy before?
I had not, I was agnostic. Just because I was so involved in science, initially planetary science and then climate science, that I had not developed an opinion, one way or the other, about whether we had to have nuclear power. But beginning in year 2000, by that time, I was wondering why IPCC only had scenarios with CO2 increasing substantially. So there was no scenario with global warming less than 2 degrees, for example. But already it was known that, well, gee, that's probably warmer than the Eemian when sea level was several meters higher. So you really will probably want to keep warming less than that. And so I wrote a paper with a few colleagues called An Alternative Scenario, because I recognized that you're not going to phase off fossil fuels quickly. We know from the history of other energies, wood, and then coal, and then oil, and quickly after that gas, that it takes several decades for the infrastructure of these different energy sources to build up or be replaced. And so I defined a scenario in which CO2 the rates of growth would go down, and by the middle of the century it'd be significantly less, but with an equal focus on non-CO2 gases, on air pollution, on tropospheric ozone and black soot and methane. And the reason to focus on air pollution was that we know that on the long run it's going to be China and India and Indonesia and other countries there that will be the source of this continuing growth. Therefore, we should try to find a solution which they will like. And I'd had the opportunity to speak to Vice President Cheney and the Energy and Climate Task Force that George Bush had asked him to head. And of course, I soon realized that their policies were basically fossil fuel. I mean, they were both oil men, Bush and Cheney. And so I decided I wanted to make a public statement that the public should really support John Kerry for president in 2004 if they're concerned about climate change. innocently thinking that since I got attention in 1988, couldn't I do that once more?
Right, right.
Well, it turned out it's not that easy to get attention.
For me, at least, climate change and understanding the energy system are just such an essential, these two puzzle pieces have to fit together, because if you're only looking at one, then you're not looking at what the solution can be, and that's not informed. And you're very vulnerable, because I think, people can be very influential, but without really understanding, what are the tools to mitigate climate change. So, sorry to interrupt, but I just had to get on the pulpit
that's
for a
exactly
second.
right. And it's not just climate science and energy science. It's also economic science and social science. There are these two basic requirements for solving the problem.
Right.
The simple carbon fee, and you have to give the money to the public, or else the public will not let this rising fee happen. You should have a simple, honest price on carbon across the board, oil, gas, coal, and collect it at the source. So it's very simple. In addition, you need carbon-free electricity. And at this time, and renewables are a big part of that. I'm all in favor of renewables, but they're not adequate by themselves, because you need baseload power which is available 24/7. Unless you had energy storage, and we're not anywhere close to having a way to store the amount of energy that you would have to store. So that means we need to support modern nuclear power.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, one thing that I learned in having the opportunity to speak to heads of big environmental groups is that almost all of them are getting donations which they would lose if they came out for nuclear power.
Yeah.
Partly because they're getting fossil fuel money, and partly because they're getting money from super rich people who came of age in the 1970s and just started anti-nuclear.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's really unfortunate, because in fact nuclear power has the smallest environmental footprint of any energy, less than the renewables. So I just don't see any way for the world to solve this problem without the help of nuclear power.
No, it's wild when you mention those environmental groups, and I mean, I call it a sort of an anti-nuclear, like, fossil opinion, because it hasn't changed in so long. The influence of these groups is wild. I think I've heard of stats looking at global operating budgets of $8 billion in the U.S. I believe it's between Friends of the Earth and NRDC. They have an annual budget of about $230 million. So this is a major industry in and of itself.
Yeah.
I mean, it has a huge impact on public policy, and we see, the closure of Indian Point, the threatened closure of Diablo Canyon. We luckily saved Byron and Dresden, but these were all campaigns that, unfortunately, these misguided environmentalists got behind. You mentioned the need for this carbon-free power, and electrify everything has become I think one of the mantras, and one of the key ways we'll have to decarbonize. But in order, if we do electrify everything, that electricity needs to be ultra reliable. We can't have our grid going down in my hospital.
Right.
And I think that's where I have serious doubts about wind and solar. Right now we're here in Germany. There's certain days where you hear news stories about Germany was 100% powered by its wind and solar fleet. Today it's a cloudy day. There's no wind. And it was coal, gas, and biomass doing almost everything except for this sliver of nuclear, which is about to disappear.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why we're here in Berlin, how you were convinced. FOTA for Climate, I think, were the key organizers that brought you to this last stand for nuclear to try and save these last 6 remaining reactors, save 1 billion tons of CO2 going to the atmosphere and thousands of lives a year from avoided air pollution. But how did FOTA for Climate convince you to come to Berlin? Because you decided COP's a waste of my time.
Yeah.
Why did you come to Berlin?
Well, because we have to try to make people understand that I don't like the fact that Germany is trying to impose their preferences on the rest of Europe, and really the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So in 2001, at the COP6 in Bonn, Germany was the host nation, and they used, I think inappropriately in my opinion, their power there to declare that nuclear power was not a clean development mechanism.
That happened again at this COP. We actually were there to witness it and record it, but they had a meeting between Germany, Portugal, Luxembourg, and there must have been another country in there, but Denmark and Austria, and it was for a nuclear-free green taxonomy. So they haven't given up. How many years later is that? COP? You said COP
Yeah,
6?
20 years later. That was 2001.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much impact that specific action had in 2001, but it's indicative of something that was happening much more broadly, namely that government support for development of nuclear was essentially zero. You know, while we had clean renewable portfolio standards imposed in most states in the United States. It's an almost unlimited subsidy,
Right.
where the utility is told you've got to get 20 or 30% or some percentage of their energy from renewables, and they do it and pass the added cost on to the customers. But we're not getting, they should have had clean energy portfolio standards. If they had done that, then it would have provided incentive for entrepreneurs and business people to develop nuclear power as well as renewables. So, and you know, I point out that when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were elected in 1992, which is now 3 decades ago, in the first State of the Union message, Clinton declared that we're terminating support for nuclear R&D because it's unnecessary.
Right.
Well, yeah, so 3 decades later, we've missed the kind of government support that was needed to drive down the unit cost of nuclear, the same way that we drove down the unit cost of renewables. Because if you look at the amount of material that goes into a nuclear plant, the amount of concrete and steel and things, there's no reason that nuclear should be so expensive as it is. It's just because we have not given it the same advantages that we gave to the renewables. They would make very good partners, nuclear and renewables, if we had just treated them equally.
You know, it's interesting. I had a friend point this out, but in the early 2000s, whenever they had a climate scientist or an activist on a major news channel, a reputable news channel like BBC or CNN, they always had to have a fair, balanced story, right? They had to have a climate denier on there with them. And, you know, I kind of dream of the day when, you know, because whenever nuclear is covered, and it's very rarely is it covered with a positive spin at all, but when they do bring on someone who's an advocate, they always bring on a opponent. And, you know, it's interesting looking at the scientific consensus, or, you know, broad consensus amongst many scientists versus the kind of idols of, you know, the anti-nuclear, the anti-genetic engineering, the anti-vax movement. They tend to be outlier scientists with a pretty strong ideologic agenda who, you know, are just, you know, they get so many honorary doctorates, they get flights here and there and everywhere because, you know, green groups or universities bring them in. And do you think we're going to get to a place, like, should nuclear energy be so controversial? Do you think we'll ever get to a place where we look back and we say, wow, it was so preposterous to have these anti-nuclear people on the show to balance it out?
Well, I don't know if it's preposterous, but I think the media they deserve to come under scrutiny, because the way that they have exaggerated the what are considered negative aspects of nuclear is a crime, really. You know, it's amazing where we still get this big objection. Even the people in Germany were saying, well, you can't do nuclear because we don't know what to do with the nuclear waste. Mm-hmm. The nuclear waste is contained, you know. It's now usually in dry cask containers. We know what to do with them, put them in geological storage, because most of that is waste from light water reactors, which is burned only about 1% of the nuclear fuel. Mm-hmm. So it's potential fuel for advanced future reactors, and you shouldn't throw it away. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's not harming anybody. Yeah. But at the same time, we allow the fossil fuels, Germany, to spew its coal emissions into the atmosphere, maybe with better collectors than some other coal plants, but still killing thousands of people. And gas plants are not, it's cleaner than coal, but it's killing thousands of people. Right. So why are we so concerned about the nuclear waste when we're dumping the waste of these others in the atmosphere and killing people with it? Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this, when I hear about that, what about the waste argument, and there's no solution. I mean, it's such an underestimation of humanity's ability to problem solve, of engineering. It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, but it's funny, but it's a tragedy, because we should not have put young people in a position where we're not ready to deal with climate change on the time scale that is needed to avoid serious consequences. So they're going to experience consequences, but still they can be much less than the worst case disasters. And we can actually get back, we will need to get back to a climate that's no warmer than the middle of the 20th century. If we want to maintain our shorelines where they are. And you might even have to go a bit cooler than that.
Right. So how do we do that? I mean, there was a study by I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it right, but the Tsinghua University in China looking at projections of how China could get to net zero. I noticed that a huge part of the study relied upon negative emissions, and this was bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Again, you just talked about how energy transition takes a long time, even when it's thermodynamically favorable, when you're moving from fuels that are less dense, are harder to use, to things like coal and petroleum and gas. These things take a while, but more importantly, do you believe the hype about negative emissions?
There was a scenario called RCP 2.6, which had emissions decreasing over time at a rate that would keep global warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, and so that was popular by the time of the Paris Accord in 2015. Then we started making graphs of that scenario and the real world. The real world climate forcing is still increasing, while that scenario had it beginning the annual growth of the forcing to start declining and eventually to go negative. Well, the real world now has a gap. If you want to close that by sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, with the current estimates for the cost of that, it would be about $1 trillion per year. Now, with a more optimistic cost estimate, it could be as low as $400 billion.
But specifically the negative emission technologies, because there's carbon capture and storage, which I think is the idea of making fossil plants carbon neutral, but this idea of actually finding a source that is negative. I mean, we're in Europe, and I think just recently they reversed the special status that the Drax plant has, a former coal plant that was turned into a biomass plant, got a sort of green certification for burning trees from South Carolina, in pellet forms, transported across the Atlantic, fed into a 4 gigawatt, retrofitted coal plant. That's one example of biomass with the idea that, well, the trees will grow back, so that's climate neutral. But this this BECCS, this bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. I understand that's burning plants, but then carbon capturing it and burying it, so it's negative. Like these technologies or scenarios, are they fantastical?
Well, so in the paper, which we titled "Young People's Burden," and we pointed out that was 2016 or so, where we point out the fact that young people are going to have to figure out a way to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. And so we looked at different ways of doing that, either extracting from the air or growing things and the biomass idea. But either of those has a cost associated with it, which the gap is already such that you're talking $500 billion to $1 trillion per year. Mm. And there's absolutely no way that we're going to do that. We can't come up with $100 billion for the rest of the world to pay for the harm that we're causing. So there's no way that we can do that. And the idea of wood pellets and things, it doesn't really add up. If you look at that very carefully, you'll find that it's not really carbon neutral or carbon negative if you're burying it.
You mentioned this figure of $100 billion a year. There was an amazing article I read. I'm forgetting the journal it was in, or it was a magazine. It was called "Mr. Hansen Goes to China." And we just heard announced a few weeks ago that China is investing $440 billion in nuclear and is planning to bring 150 gigawatts of nuclear online in the next 15 years, which is the most nuclear that's, I think, ever been built in one country and on a very short timeline. France did a third of that with their Mesmer plant. I mean, they're a much smaller country. I want to give you a tiny bit of credit for that, or maybe more. Tell us about that trip, because I think you left, was it the Copenhagen COP, which was an utter disaster, and you went to China. Tell me about your motivation there and what the conversations were like and how you feel about what's the most recent announcement there.
I had a great opportunity to go to China. I was invited in January of 2014 by the Kissinger Institute for China-United States cooperation or relations, invited to give the climate talk at a symposium on a new type of great power relations. Mm-hmm. So this was during the Obama administration, when it was closer to being friendly relations between the United States and China. And I gave a very blunt talk on what I thought was needed, namely carbon fee and nuclear power, modern nuclear power. And I said we should cooperate on that, because the truth is we have in the United States innovation ideas and capabilities which would be great, but there's just not the demand in the United States to develop these and drive the cost down to a level where it's as cheap as coal. Mm-hmm. But if we worked with China, cooperated, they have a tremendous need for clean energy, and they have terrible air pollution they would like to fix. Mm-hmm. Well, so that, but then after the first day of this meeting, we were given a tour to different cities, to what they were doing in different cities, and they focused on their development of solar panels and windmills, which they now are developing more than any other country and installing more than any other country in the world. But when the mayor of a large city showed what they were doing and what their plans were for these renewable energies, I noticed that, well, all that hard work was still not even causing the rate of coal use to decrease. Coal use was still shooting up, despite their strong efforts in renewables. So I wondered, why don't we also talk about nuclear power? They had been snowed by Amory Lovins, the way many countries were snowed by him. But they were learning.
What do you mean snowed by Amory Lovins? Just briefly.
Well, he says you don't need. He says that energy efficiency and renewables can do the whole job.
Right.
You don't need fossil fuels. You don't need large hydro. You don't need a carbon tax. You don't need nuclear power.
So what would happen in Germany today where there's no sun and no wind and it's all coal, gas, and biomass?
Yeah, well, that's in practice. That's what you learn when you try to do it. I mean, I think Germany may eventually do it, but it's going to take them many, many decades, and other countries are not going to have that much money to do it that way. So. This is actually an important issue. Let's not be laughing about it, because the U.S. and China are in the same boat. We're either going to sail together or we're going to sink together.
Right. I think a huge challenge for the West is becoming humble again, because China is rising, and honestly, the West is in decline in terms of our ability to manage a pandemic, infrastructure, et cetera. And you know what? China's really good at building nuclear plants. The construction, getting it done on budget, on time. And it seems like the West needs to say, all right, come help us out, teach us how to do some of these things. And I mean, I don't know if that's possible, because there's hubris, and we're used to being the colonizer, right?
Well, no, I think we have a lot to offer also. You know, if we don't cooperate, China will figure out that they will build their own nuclear plants. I think we could probably do it better together. But they are going to replace their coal eventually, but they know that it's going to take several decades. And that's why when President Xi says, well, we'll aim for 2060, and the Indian Prime Minister, is that the right title, Modi, says they'll aim for 2070, it's because they know that changing your basic energy system is a big task. If we cooperated, we could do it a lot faster. So the U.S. needs to realize that, first of all, we're more responsible for climate change than any other nation on Earth, easily. Even than China, despite the fact that their emissions are larger now, but it's the historical emissions, the cumulative emissions that cause climate change. And the United States is still most responsible for that.
So let's talk about that, because you've talked about the rise of China, India, Indonesia. You know, a lot more energy demand and carbon use will be happening there. But Africa, I believe they're responsible for only something like 3 or 4% of historic emissions. They want to industrialize. They want to see those benefits of improved lifespans, decreased child mortality, more secure food. Decouple Media was at Glasgow, and one of our South African friends, Princess, I'm going to blank her on her last name, Thambani, and our Peruvian-American friend, Shirley Rodriguez, they did sort of a tour of Africa, going to each of the pavilions. And, you know, it was very interesting. And there's kind of this paradox, because you know, they need to develop. That development's going to cause climate change. Fossil fuels are kind of the most available thing. In terms of that historic carbon debt, it seems like there's, you know, a real duty on, you know, industrialized nations, especially those that have nuclear, to help these countries develop a nuclear program quickly, so that they can really leapfrog fossil fuels and use something that gives the services that fossil fuels do in terms of, you know, reliable electricity. Because one of their questions was, you know, how much electricity, how many people in your country, what percentage have electricity? And they said, well, it depends on what you mean. because, blackouts, right? Access and reliability are another thing, and reliability really underpins the ability to industrialize. So what are your thoughts about the rise of Africa, its right to industrialize? We titled our video something along the lines of, it was inspired by Samir Saran's line. He says, "Our poverty cannot be your climate solution." So how do you engage with those real developing countries that are demanding to develop and whose fossil fuel use is going to increase substantially in the next 50 to 100 years?
It's to our advantage if Africa develops economically. People ask whenever I give a talk, well, you can't solve this problem because the population of the earth is still going up. Well, if you want the population to stabilize, you need to have growing economies. In the West, the fertility rate is below replacement level in almost all countries now. Because once a country becomes fairly wealthy and the women are educated, they don't all want to have big families. And so, and that just seems to be universal. So we should encourage and be happy to see Africa develop. And we should not force on them their choices as to their energy sources. That's why I object to the fact that Germany and some other countries, are trying to restrict nations to do things the way they think they should be done.
Right.
It's not their right to do that.
Princess and Shirley actually attended a German announcement. Everything happens so serendipitously at COP. You just stumble into an announcement that's being made. But it was very pertinent because it was about German efforts to really push a wind and solar model on South Africa to help them get off coal. And I'm blanking. I'm very tired right now. But the hypocrisy of that statement, while this year Germany's grid is the number one source in their grid is coal at 27%. Princess's jaw had just dropped. But these sort of comments are really uncontroversial here in Germany. I had an interview with the spokesperson for the German delegation, and he said, absolutely, we have to stick to the nuclear phase out. It doesn't matter if there's more air pollution deaths. We've got good air controls. We're going to be off coal by 2038, 17 years from now. And yeah, we're building a bunch of gas, but we'll be off of it by 2045.
Yeah.
I don't know. Tell me a bit more about your reactions to being here in Germany. We talked about why you're here, the save the German 6, the last remaining reactors. You've had the opportunity to interact with some Germans. You've talked to media. You've obviously talked with a lot of pro-nuclear advocates. Let's leave that out because that'll be less interesting. But what have your interactions been like with members of the German public or press?
Okay, I think the most relevant interaction with Germany actually occurred a few years earlier. I was actually encouraged by someone in Germany to write a letter to the German Chancellor Merkel. And it was going to be published in Die Zeit, if that's the right pronunciation of the big newspaper in Germany. But the science advisor to Merkel called me and said, oh, why don't you come over and talk with us? Because you can have a better chance of having an impact if you come and talk to us rather than write something in the newspaper. So I did that, but I found that, and the meeting ended up being with Sigmar Gabriel, who was either the environment minister or energy minister. He had both jobs at different times. I don't remember which one he had at that moment. But the big discussion that we had was the idea of carbon fee and dividend. I was already trying to sell that idea, that you have to have an across-the-board carbon fee. And he said, no, we're going to do this emission trading scheme. And scheme is the right word, because they were scheming to give away rights so that the fossil fuels could continue quite a while.
Yeah, and they use up so many of those credits because they're rich.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Then when I went to China, they understood this immediately. But of course, before they can do a fee and dividend, they need and phase out carbon. They need some way to get their electricity carbon free, and that's why the nuclear is crucial for them. But that was so different than the reaction I got in Germany, where they just will not reconsider their emission trading scheme. And even Merkel flies over to Japan and to China and different places and try to persuade them to follow the German example.
I don't mean to be like crude about it, but they really do seem to not be that perturbed with burning fossil fuels. They're not like, they are existentially terrified of nuclear power, and I've heard there's certain reasons for that. Post-war thing, not having nuclear weapons themselves. I haven't investigated enough to understand, but it is a real culture phenomena. Despite that, apparently there is growing support for stopping the phase out of these last 6 reactors, at least holding it back. But my experience just at the Save the German 6 rally that we had yesterday, I went out and talked to probably 30 different groups of people in the crowds that were gathering kind of around us or just passing by the Brandenburg Gate. And I was trying to start conversations. I'm a pretty charismatic, friendly, extroverted guy. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, including juggling. I was there in my doctor scrubs, juggling, and I can juggle well enough that I can talk to people as I kind of go by. So I was pulling out all the stops, trying to get some conversations going. Yeah. And I talked to a few, Belgians, a few from the UK, some Americans, but not a lie. Every single German I talked to, nine. And I would walk alongside them, and did you know about coal's the dominant source on your grid right now? I don't want to talk about it. They're just so allergic, at least this sample size, and hopefully it's not representative of the whole country, as some polls are showing. But has that been your response? Did you get to talk to many? I'm not sure if any kind of anti-nuclear people you got a chance to really chat with them, but
I understand that the textbooks in German schools just have blatant flawed descriptions of nuclear energy and its effects, and the description of the accidents that have occurred.
Right.
Those accidents would not occur with a power plant that shuts down in the case of an anomaly and doesn't require external power for cooling the fuel. But even if you include those accidents, the safety record of nuclear energy exceeds that of the other energies.
What about these so-called sort of dead zones around Fukushima and Chernobyl?
Sure, that's what you don't want to happen again. And so having this pressurized reactors, where you don't want to have an explosion, but if it does occur, the idea of evacuating enormous area, Fukushima, boy, there are aspects to this nuclear story which are just hard to believe. But one of the nastiest things, and I want to relate it to Fukushima and these accidents, but is the fact that the Democratic Party in the United States has historically appointed anti-nuclear people to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, if you can believe that.
I can.
Well, one of them, and again, I have not looked up the pronunciation of his name, but Jackso or something like that. Yeah. He was an assistant to Senator Harry Reid, who blackmailed George W. Bush, into appointing Jackso to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission by holding up all of Bush's planned appointments until he agreed to do that.
Right.
Well, then, when Obama became president, he Harry Reid twisted his arm to make JAXO the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Mm-hmm. Then when Fukushima exploded, JAXO went bananas. Mm-hmm. This was his opportunity to eliminate nuclear power from the planet Earth.
Right.
And he told Americans they should all evacuate Japan.
The military was about to pull out because the radiation level was going to be something like 10% higher than the permissible doses are set so incredibly low, and compared to other areas in the world, like you'd have to evacuate all of Kerala, India, if you had the same standards as Fukushima, right? But
he also advised the Japanese government to evacuate an enormous area.
Right.
Well, the government didn't follow that, but they still evacuated an area which was extremely large, and it ended up causing the deaths of more than 1,000 people just because of the stress on having to leave their homes, especially old people. In the end, there are now papers by the medical profession that say you really shouldn't have evacuated at all. Mm-hmm. But a smaller area around the reactors would make sense but there's no emergency to instantly tell everybody to get out of there. Mm-hmm. But you don't want that to happen again. And I say with modern reactors, I would be surprised if it happened once in 500 years. Mm-hmm. But the effect of radiation is so greatly exaggerated. The real crime is that one of the crimes is that now the regulation on nuclear radiation, on radiation, is that the reactors must be designed to make it as low as reasonably possible. The engineers throw up their arms and say, I don't know how to design to that standard. Because if you have a certain reactor, you say, well, I could still make that safer. I'll put another containment vessel over top. So it becomes so expensive for no good reason. No other energy source has such a constraint. Mm-hmm. And as I say, if you look at the actual statistics, the safety record, even with these old reactors, is better than any other energy source.
Right. I want to talk briefly about, in maybe the last 10 years, this idea of like an influencer has really become a thing. And I mean, it obviously describes an older phenomena that probably dates back to our hunter-gatherer days, right? But, as a doctor who's trained in critical appraisal of the literature and evidence-based medicine, practicing and analyzing studies is a lot of work, and I do look at some studies, but it's overwhelming, and so I have to put my faith in people that I really trust, who that's their whole thing, is they just comb the literature critically. No one human can do it all.
Right.
And it was interesting. You were just giving a lecture, which we're going to be releasing, and hearing from your mouth, certain statements around, the world being naturally radioactive, that no one actually died from this triple meltdown at Fukushima from radiation. When you say that, you speak with this kind of authority, and I think it's due to people identifying that you have good values, that you care deeply about the future of humanity. Your next book is written, I think that's
Sophie's Planet.
Sophie's Planet.
Almost finished.
And I don't know. I think there's such a role for that, and you've been courageous, I think, in taking a principled stand, whether that's in 1988, representing yourself as a private citizen in order to not be censored, the decision to endorse nuclear energy as a keystone climate change technology. That's taken a lot of courage and come with some price. Do you feel like, having made those decisions, it sounds like it's kind of affected your funding and to some degree your ability to have an effect on the world. But how would you weigh those things, being principled and following what you're feeling is the truth, Maybe that's a silly question, but
yeah, because I think a scientist, science is by its nature honest.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, of course, there are always interpretations, and so some scientists will come to different conclusions. But the great thing, and the reason that I say I want to be a political independent, is the essence of being a good scientist is to re-look at a problem. As soon as there's more evidence on the problem, you have to reassess your interpretation and do it without bias. And that's really all that I'm trying to do, and all, what I learned as learning science at the University of Iowa. And I'm just very simple-minded.
This is a little disjointed, but we'll cut it in maybe earlier into the interview. But just briefly, your thoughts on geoengineering, whether that's necessary, what the trigger point should be. Should we be doing it already, given how quickly the ice caps are starting to destabilize, or the albedo effect from diminishing, Arctic sea ice? What are your thoughts on it? Should we do it? Yes, no, and what do you think the triggers should be?
Yeah, it's the word geoengineering is an unfortunate choice of words, or at least we need to explain to the public that, in fact, we are geoengineering the devil out of the planet right now. We're pouring energy into the ocean at a rate which is at least 10 times greater than any time in Earth's history. And warming is occurring at a rate at least 10 times greater than during the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago. First of all, we have to understand better what happened during the Eemian. That's the last interglacial period, which was a bit warmer than the Holocene, the current interglacial period. But sea level rose to several meters higher than now, and there was a time during the Eemian when sea level went up suddenly by at least a few meters within less than 100 years. And so almost surely that was the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, because you can't get rapid sea level rise from Greenland. The West Antarctic ice sheet is sitting on bedrock way below sea level. So it could collapse quite rapidly, and probably that was what happened. But we need to know that, because I think we may get to a point where we need to cool down the southern part of the southern hemisphere. And we could do that. So we actually have done experiments with the global climate model, in which I reported at a meeting of the first joint meeting of the Chinese Academy of Science and the American Geophysical Union a few years ago, where we did these experiments where we put aerosols in the stratosphere, either globally or hemispherically or over the Southern Ocean.
And they kind of stay within there just because of they don't
well,
diffuse to the whole
so in
planet,
our experiment they stayed, and that actually is approximately what would happen depending on where you put them, because the circulation takes the aerosols toward the pole if you're putting it in at relatively high latitudes. So you could do that, but I don't think you'd want to do that geoengineering, because there's a much easier way, and that is to do it in the troposphere. You could spray salt particles into the atmosphere and do it just over the Southern Ocean. Nobody lives there, and it will affect the cloud cover. And what we showed, though, was reflecting sunlight from those latitudes actually has the opposite effect of what we were finding due to the fresh water injection from the ice sheet, which was slowing down and eventually shutting down this overturning ocean circulation.
Wow.
So if you instead cool it, the atmosphere, it actually increases that overturning circulation. And the reason that overturning circulation is important is because that's an escape valve for heat from the deep ocean. And if that escape valve gets closed, which is what the freshwater melt does, then that heat instead melts the ice shelves faster and faster.
Right.
And that's what we don't want to happen. So we had better understand that, because there's a lot of evidence that this is already starting. The overturning circulation in the North Atlantic is already slowing down, and the overturning circulation in the southern hemisphere is slowing down. Now, it had a burp in 2016 where it sped up again, associated with Super El Nino. But now it's going back to, it seems to be going back. And we're not making the measurements.
Is there pressure not to study it because it's a taboo subject? Because it's. I mean, certainly the environmental groups.
So no, because it's not geoengineering we're talking about. When I say the measurements are not being made, I'm talking about the measurements in the Southern Ocean and around the ice
Is that
shelves.
to understand geoengineering? Like, I feel like research into it is not being allowed to happen because it's a taboo subject. I mean, it would take global cooperation to do.
You know, scientists are ignoring. There's all kinds of papers being written now on geoengineering, but there's not enough support for the measurements that need to be done to understand the physics of the system, independent of geoengineering, but just understanding how sensitive the ice shelves are to the forcing that we're applying. And that forcing has increased noticeably in just the last decade. The planet is now further out of energy balance, with an imbalance that's almost twice as large as what it was a couple of decades ago.
I guess, hopefully the final question, just because I want to respect your time, we have to get on a flight a little early in the day, is, we talk about the climate models almost exclusively as what's going to happen by 2100. What are your thoughts about what's going to happen after 2100? I pray that my son will be alive in 2100. He'll be in his 80s. But I think about his children, and you think about Sophie. So, what's going to happen after that? Are we being incredibly short-sighted? Are we doing that out of just maybe a fear of our own mortality? I'm trying to think of why we're...
It is a screwy limit to put on because of the fact, in the case of sea level, the fact that ice sheet mass loss is likely to be exponential. And you could, even this century, we could have multimeter sea level rise, in my opinion. But I think, so it all depends. I think that I'm optimistic because young people have become very interested. And so far, they just say things like, well, fix the problem, know. And Greta says these cops are just blah, blah, blah. And she's right in the sense that they're not attacking the fundamental, they're not making the fundamental changes that are needed. But I think we're going to fix this, but we had better get on the path soon, because changing global energy systems takes decades, and we can't pretend that we're going to do it in the 2020s. And anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Dr. Hansen, thank you so much.
Sorry I don't have the answers, but
hey, I mean, that's for I can't believe it. You're 80 years old. You look like you're in your 50s. You move like you're in your 50s. Because every person who's like elderly and looks like they're in good shape, or who hits 100, they always get this question, what's your secret? And they always have the most ridiculous answers.
No, well, my answer is you need high cardio exercise. In my video for
you have an exercise video set?
I'm going to make one.
Oh my
I promise
God.
In chapter 5, I think it is, of Sophie's Planet, I promise I'm going to make this little video.
Amazing. All right. We're going to leave it there. Keep recording for a second. Can I ask you to do me a big favor?
Sure.
Can you look at the
Don't mean I'll do it, but you can
ask. Yeah, of course, you can always ask. Would you be able to look at the camera and ask people to give a 5-star review?
Give a what?
A 5-star review of the podcast. and to What's the other things they got to do? They got to 5-star review.
Sign up for the mailing list. Is that on the website?
Yeah, and then I don't want to give you too many tasks here, but certainly subscribe to the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Able to do that?
Okay. All right. So well, what I will do is ask you, the audience, to give you whatever star review it deserves. I don't know if it's 5-star. It's kind of dubious, but and also sign up for the YouTube channel, and it's a mailing list. I have my own mailing list, by the way.
Now we're having a competitive interest. Sign up to James's email list. Go to the Decouple website. Sign up there. We do have a mailing list that we're putting out every month. Summarizes all the episodes. Maybe we'll get some other little features in there. But we are really growing at Decouple. We're kind of joking about how many ventures we have. We always have the podcast. We've got Decouple Studios that Jesse is hosting and doing an amazing job of. We've got Decouple Shorts, Decouple Digest, and we have Decouple Acrobatics featuring Dylan Moon. You have to check out that viral backflip for nuclear video he did. Anyway, guys, we are running out of time. We are going to leave you now, and we're going to be wrapping up what's been a crazy 10 days with the Decouple media team at COP and in Berlin. I'm looking forward to getting a nice rest tonight and taking you to the airport tomorrow.
Great.
And joining you on our flight to Iceland and then parting ways.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks again, Jim.
Okay.
All right.